Hello and welcome to this CNBC Africa special broadcast of Nigeria's Independence Day. The Diamond Jubilee of Africa's largest economy is a time to look back, take stock, and more importantly, plan strategically for the future. No doubt the COVID-19 pandemic has been a major issue here, talking about how things that have impacted Nigeria. But Nigeria has to set back its growth trajectory. But how can Nigeria lay the building blocks to drive this going forward? My guests for this special broadcast are renowned economist Bismarck Rewane, who is the CEO of Financial Derivatives. I also have Professor Remi Sonaiya. She's the Nigerian politician and ex-presidential candidate for KOWA party at the 2015 elections. I also have Benson Adenuga. He's the head of office and coverage director for Nigeria at the CDC Group. The CDC Group is the United Kingdom's development finance institution. And my last guest, who will join us in a bit, is Dr. Tam-George. He's the executive director of the Institute of Communications and Corporate Studies. Let's start with Bismarck. 60 years for Nigeria, Bismarck. How should we approach this celebration?
Well, I think it's time to have sober reflections. We've gone 60 years in which I can say we've gone from evolution to revolution, which was a civil war, to malformation, and ended up in a transition. Hopefully we'll get to a transformation. That's where we should see ourselves. So it's 60 years in which we've gone from a command economy to a mixed economy, and now we're probably going to take off into a free market economy. It's 60 years in which the GDP per capita has actually gone from something like $92, or what $92 was worth in 1960, to $2,000 we are today. It's also a period in which we've gone from 45 million people to 209 million people in terms of population. It's a time when our GDP has actually increased from $45 million and down to $450 billion. So it's a mixed bag, but generally a time of missed opportunities, which we have gone from potential to suboptimal outcomes. But in all cases, we've had unintended consequences. But this is crunch time for Nigeria. We can't afford to rest on our hours anymore.
All right, Bismarck says missed opportunities there, but quite a lot when you look at the economic numbers. But Professor Sonaiya, I would like to get your thoughts for Nigeria at 60.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I quite agree with Mr. Rewane. It has been a time of shattered hopes and dreams, I believe, for the common people, for the citizens in general. I was 5 years old at independence, and I remember that time, even though I was very young, I had a lot of, how would I put it, hopes and dreams for the nation, even at that young age. I went on to school, primary school. It was wonderful. Secondary school, up until the university, everything was going well until I graduated from the university with a bachelor's in 1977. And then from the mid-80s, things just started going downhill. And that has been the experience of a lot of people. So, but I believe that we are standing at a position where we can choose the path that we're going to take. We can choose a different path, but that won't just happen. We have to be deliberate about it. And I believe that it's a time to frontally address a lot of the issues that are confronting us, a lot of the challenges that we have as a nation at this time. I think we have been skirting around many of the problems, not wanting maybe to offend a certain part of the society. And I think that this might be time to really address these issues. I'm in Lagos currently. I don't live in Lagos right now. I live in Ife, but I have been shocked at the number of beggars, the increase in the number of beggars in Lagos, in Ibadan, or your state, even in my state, Osun State, there has been an influx of beggars from the northern part of Nigeria, and we have to address this issue. So we have been hesitating, hedging, and hawing, but I think this is time, if we are going to move forward, to really frontally address those issues. However, I'm very positive that about the future of Nigeria, even at this time, in spite of all the problems confronting us.
She's positive despite the challenges that we are seeing in the country. Mr. Adenuga, your take.
Thank you very much, Kenneth. I will agree with the Prof as well as Mr. Rewane that for Nigeria, it has been a mixed bag over the past 60 years. When you look at some of the statistics today in Nigeria, you will see that over 82 million of our people, that's over 40%, are living below the poverty line. Today, if you look at employment and underemployment, it's about 55% of our people. I mean, those are not interesting statistics. So when you look at it, there are a number of areas, as previously described, that are really missed opportunities. But at the same time, when you look at some areas where we have made progress, for example, I kind of thinking about the mobile telecommunication industry. Remember in 2001 or so, when the industry, really kicked off, we had about 400,000 lines. Today, we have over 180 million lines. That's over 90% teledensity. You look at industry like the cement industry, for example. Just over a decade ago, Nigeria was importing clinkers from all over the world. But today, we have multiples of that in capacity. So from the way I see it, there are a lot of positive areas. But in addition to that, it's intermixed with a lot of disappointing areas. For me, the challenge is that you look at where the country is today, and you look at where we could have been. That is, for me, where the big disappointment is. Given Nigeria's human capital, given the country's economic resources, given the country's agricultural potential, you look at where we are today. We continue to talk about dependence on oil. We have been talking about this for so long, and we're still talking about it in year 2020. So from where I see it, it's really a very mixed bag, a lot of challenging areas, and a few positive areas to point out.
Definitely quite a lot to ponder on when you look at how Nigeria has played out the 60 years so far. But let's get the thoughts of Dr. Austin Tam-George, who is joining us from Port Harcourt. Dr. Tam-George, I would like to get your thoughts on Nigeria at 60.
Thank you for having me, Ken. We have a very, very disappointing, trajectory, that we've been on. If you see from the time this government came into office in May 2015, Nigerians expected a great deal of momentum on all fronts: the economic front, the political front, the anti-corruption front. But if you look at the details, it's very disappointing the kind of performance index that we've seen. It was within the period, the past 5 years, that Nigeria became, ranked as the capital for the highest number of poor people in the world. And there is no sense, as I speak now, that status is going to change. If you look at the security statistics, all the reports point to a decline in the overall security situation in the country, specifically in the north. If you look at the will to be competitive, the sense is that there is a governmental lethargy. We haven't seen the kind of momentum, so earnestly forward to since 2015. So it's a very disappointing picture that we have. But I think that if we can at least have the kind of political leadership that can organize transparent electoral process counting down to 2023, perhaps we can look a bit more hopefully at the political environment. But right now, there is no sense, in fact, that we have the leadership that can inspire any hope on any front, I'm sorry to say.
All right, then, but then Dr. Tam-George raising the leadership question there when you look at how things have played out for Nigeria. But for me, I'd like to get into what we're seeing the growth trajectory for Nigeria play out. We're seeing a COVID-19 pandemic come through to affect our growth trajectory. We saw we're in a recession just about 5 years ago. We've been struggling to get out of that situation. And now we're seeing this pandemic come to disrupt how the economy is growing. Let me start again from the economist here, Bismarck Rewane, and I'd like to get your thoughts because quite a lot of times we've talked about tough decisions that need to be made to get things going and get our ducks in a row to see that growth trajectory moving up. But for you though, looking at how the COVID-19 is playing out in Nigeria, how can we build back better strategically?
I think COVID is an opportunity to press the reset button. Basically, what has happened in Nigeria is that we had structural defects and we had operational problems, and then we had the COVID coming in. So all of this created what we can call a perfect storm. But taking the present without taking what lessons from the past, I want you to imagine that our GDP in 1960 was $4 billion. Our rate of growth was 0.19% rate of growth. We got all the way up to around 7 or 8%, and then we dropped now to minus 6%, obviously because of COVID. In the period between 1960 and today, then we had maybe 1 or 2 universities. I think 1960 we had about something. Now we have about 400. But what quality is coming out of this? Our life expectancy in 1960 was 37 years, and today our life expectancy is 53 years, even after topping it up. But what is more important was that at this time, our GDP per capita was twice that of China. Today, China's GDP per capita is 5 times ours, which is $10,000. So when you look at everything, and our population was 45 million in 1960. The UK population was about 57 million at that time. The UK population today is about 70 million, ours is 209. So we've increased our population, if we can believe those numbers, we've increased our population by a factor of over 4 or 5 times. Whilst, our contemporaries have not actually grown. So your GDP growth has been stalled, your population growth has been increasing, so the income per capita. And so there's no question about poverty is an outcome of once your growth rate is lower than your population growth rate, then poverty is a normal outcome. So what do we do now? How do we ensure that we can jumpstart? And I use China as an example because if 30, 40 years ago, Chinese GDP was half that of Nigeria, and today it is 5 times that of Nigeria, with a massive population population structure. Now, what have they done? They've limited their population growth with a 1-man, 1-child family. They've achieved basically about double-digit growth over the last 20 years. They've lifted 700 million people out of poverty by taking some very, very aggressive moves. But what is more important is that they've had both a consumer-led strategy as well as an investment-led strategy. And so we have to now decide, now that we know where we are, we know that we have to address our structural defects, we now need to make some very, very, very aggressive and bold decisions to be able to lift, to achieve growth, double-digit growth, or if not, growth above 7 or 8% over a 10-year period. That way we can catch up and actually outperform our peer countries. For example, Togo has a population of 8 million people. I want you to imagine land space of Togo compared to ours. So there are some very, very important decisions that we have to make now, because we don't have the time to prevaricate on this. That's my contention at this point in time.
All right, then Bismarck says we need to make tough decisions if we're going to improve the quality of life of Nigerians. Professor Sonaiya, I'd like to get your thoughts on looking at the Nigeria's development trajectory. We've seen poverty being a major factor here on how our development has grown so far. But I'd like to get your thoughts on this and what you think Nigeria should be doing to get those numbers down.
Thank you very much. I'd first like to say, in terms of our economic growth, or lack of it actually, that we all know that poverty has a largely feminine face. There's no doubt about that. Women feel the impact of poverty much more severely than do men. I also would like to link the issue of population that was raised by Mr. Rewane to this matter. We find that Nigerian women, a large majority of Nigerian women, have been turned basically into a baby-making machine. You know, that has been the major preoccupation of a lot of Nigerian women since independence. I mean, for some reason, it seems to be that people believe that our population, the more people they have in their areas, you know, and that is linked to the way in which we are sharing our resources, you know, the income from oil, because it is shared in terms of population and so on. So there seems to have been an interest in several areas of just multiplying the number of people, increasing the population, so that our women have been kept busy just making babies rather than developing their potential, contributing to the progress and well-being of the country. And I think that we have to do something drastic about this. We cannot have people, we saw in the Senate, or was it in the House recently, that one of the members of the Nigerian National Assembly came to parade his 4 wives on the floor of the assembly, and boast that he already had 27 children at home, and you know, that I'm sure it's not the end of it. How could we have people with such a mindset running our affairs? So those women are just there as a baby factory. And I think that that cannot be separated from the reason for our uncontrolled population increase, as well as the abject poverty in which Nigerians find themselves today, especially women and children. So this is a major concern for a lot of people, and it has to be addressed seriously.
All right, definitely quite a lot to look at when you look at how that population is affecting Nigeria's development trajectory. Let me bring in Benson here, and let's look at the role investments could play. Earlier today, I was reading a recent document from Deloitte, and they mentioned some of the top 5 destinations for capital in Africa. Nigeria was not on that list. They had countries like Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Kenya, Rwanda, and Senegal there as the top 5 destinations for capital. And I'm thinking Nigeria should definitely be on this list. What do you think, Mr. Adenuga?
Thank you very much, Kenneth. I think that's a very valid point. In terms of attractiveness to investments, for a country with a population of over 200 million people, that is a large market. And therefore, you will expect that Nigeria should be quite attractive to a number of investors. I've had the opportunity of interacting with a lot of investors overseas, strategic financial investors. who are looking to do more in Africa. And the size of the Nigerian market is something they always talk about. But the reality is that we are not competitive as a country in terms of attracting investment. Just give you a clear indication. The World Bank Ease of Doing Business ranking, rates Nigeria 131 out of 190 countries. And I think to sort of make it clearer, even though Nigeria moved 15 places between 2019 and 2020, the reality is that 15 African countries are ranked in Nigeria on that scale. And in fact, what is a bit more depressing is the fact that you look at countries like Togo, for example, you look at countries like Djibouti, countries like Eswatini. These are relatively small countries, but they are ranked as being more attractive, than Nigeria. And we need to ask ourselves, what are the key factors that are really, making us less competitive on the ease of doing business ranking? And when you look at the latest number, it's very clear. You look at factors like getting electricity. We ranked very poorly on that indicator. You look at registering property. We rank very poorly. You look at trading across borders. You speak to a lot of manufacturers in the country today who have to import raw materials. And you will see that it is a huge struggle to be able to get anything, through the borders at the ports. We need to address all of that for us to become a lot more competitive. The issue of infrastructure is a major one as well. It's one of the reasons why the cost of doing business is quite high in the country, and it becomes difficult for investors to come to this market. But investment can actually, deliver very strong impact in ensuring that the country grows. When you look at what people like us are doing, like CDC is doing, we basically provide long-term investment, and we've been working in this country for about 70 years. We want to do more in the country. We are putting over $450 million in this market. In terms of trade, we have done over $20 million today in the market. We want to do more. But to be able to do that, the environment needs to be conducive. We need to make sure that all those reforms that we need to put in place that will encourage investors need to be there. And if we're looking for foreign investors, I have to mention this point, that the whole thing around our foreign exchange regime is an important one. When you have investors who have brought money to the country, they've invested, they want to leave the country, but they have to queue up for several weeks or several months to be able to repatriate funds. It does not encourage investments to come into the country. We need to address all of that for us to be able to make sure that we become more competitive in Nigeria.
All right, that's a very interesting point you put out there. Definitely quite a lot to ponder when you look at how things have played out. Dr. Tam-George, let me bring you in on this one. Still talking about the Nigeria's development trajectory. We've seen COVID-19 do quite a lot of damage there. But for you, though, would you say Nigeria has lived up to that social contract with Nigerians?
No, we haven't seen. We haven't seen the kind of right mix of leadership and public policy that should inspire confidence that we are going to have a better trajectory. I don't like to sound pessimistic, but if you look at all the indicators, my colleagues on the panel have mentioned, not only are the indicators negative, you also don't get the sense that there is a sense of urgency on the part of those in the administration at all levels in the country to bring the kind of change that we are talking about. COVID-19 has exposed the kind of sectoral setbacks, that we've always known in the health sector. You don't get the sense that primary healthcare delivery systems across the states were effective, even with the COVID-19. You need to have primary healthcare systems because those systems are the closest to the people. And when people become unwell, the primary healthcare delivery systems are the first line of defense in those kind of pandemics. But we didn't have that. And, you know, if you look at education, the indicators are just as dismal. We still have the highest number of children out of school in the world. The last time it was about 13.5 million children out of school. With the COVID-19, I suspect that the numbers have increased over the past 4 or 5 months or so. If you look at water supply, there is hardly a city in Nigeria, hardly a state where there is efficient, you know, pipeline water supply to homes, millions of homes across the country. In the event of the pandemic, especially a pandemic that requires a great deal of public sanitation and personal hygiene, you know, we didn't have, you know, water supplied, you know, to people in their homes. I'm talking about major cities, not to mention the water crisis that we found in hundreds of thousands of communities across the country. So what we are seeing is an unfortunate regression, not just economic regression, but also political regression. I think that we need the structure of the country so that we can have the right set of leadership to come up with to meet the expectations of our people.
But now let's switch it up a gear and get into what the role of trade and competitiveness can play for Nigeria as it looks to, you know, take its position in the Committee of Nations in Africa. And let me start with Bismarck. Looking at how things are going, you know, with AFCFTA brings a lot of promise, and definitely the promise is for the people who are prepared, businesses that are prepared to take advantage of this trade pact. From where you sit, though, is Nigeria doing enough to take advantage of the AFCFTA?
Not enough, but at least we've started a ratification process. The most important thing is the ratification. Once that is done, then the AFCFTA is a potential, it's a game changer in terms of opportunities. It also means that you must be competitive as not just as a country, but as companies, because there will be what we call the drift towards economies of scale and a localization of industry. So you got to actually deal with those issues about the ease of doing business. You got to do something about your currency. You got to do something about your interest rate environment, and you just have to be basically competitive and understand that you are competing for capital. That is the key thing. So I believe that it will be the main catalyst for ideological shift of just adopting the mixed economic model and moving towards a free market economic model. When that is done, then the potential, basically what you have right now is a recessionary gap where the potential GDP is growing at an average around 4 or 5%, while real GDP is growing at about 2%. And that's what they call a recessionary gap. Basically, I believe that at that point, Nigeria will be forced to do all the right things and stop doing the dumb thing, because like Farid Zakaria says, you have to stop doing the dumb things, start doing the smart things then before you start doing the modern things. So that we have to go through that process very quickly, or else, again, it may be another generation of missed opportunities which we cannot afford at this point in time. More than anything else, your exchange rate has to be in what we call the RER. It has to have the real effective exchange rate path, because at that point in time, even your petroleum products, fertilizers, your currency, your electricity, and all of that has to be priced at market. And then people have to be efficient in the use of these resources. That is the major driver. So I think trade will be a major catalyst which will drive exchange rate policy change, interest rate policy change, to drive regional integration, and to actually increase the localization of industry.
All right, let me bring in Dr. Sonaiya here. Looking at that environment, Bismarck mentioned, talking about the environment for doing business. Do you think we're encouraging our entrepreneurs enough to bring that engine of growth for the economy?
Let me talk as a non-expert in terms of the economy and trade and stuff like that. For me, what we have to really improve upon in the country is, one, our productivity, and then also the quality of our work. You know that a lot of workers are still being brought in from across our border, from Benin Republic, from Togo, even from Nigeria. Take, for example, in the building industry, construction, a lot of people, when they are building their houses, they prefer to get the masons, the carpenters, even cooks. They prefer to get them from Benin, from Togo, from Ghana. Why? Because they do better work. Nigerians must learn to do good quality work. And if this has to do with um, demanding certification or whatever, then we have to do it. We are not competitive even within our own borders, not to mention what we can now export. It is important that in the arts, in the creative industries and so on, Nigeria is beginning to have things to export in entertainment, in arts, fabrics and stuff like that. This is quite encouraging, but we still have a very, very long way to go in terms of the quality of our goods. We just don't make good enough quality. That is why goods that come from abroad and services from abroad are so attractive to a lot of us, people who have money and are willing to buy. Of course, they would wish to buy something that is of a high quality if they can find it. So this is an area that I believe also has to be addressed in terms of the quality of work that we do, as well as just our general productivity in the country. Thank you.
Definitely a lot of work needs to be done if we're going to be competitive as the AFCFTA is coming on board. Mr. Adenuga, let me bring you here and then let's look at the opportunities we could see in the AFCFTA and how we could drive more investment into Nigeria with this.
Thank you very much, Kenneth. I think like my fellow panelists have said, the issue of competitiveness is one that we really cannot overemphasize. But beyond that, I also want to highlight a few other dimensions that are very important. When you look at our economy, it is dominated by small and medium scale enterprises. We look at agricultural space, we have a lot of very small holder farmers. So if we are going to be competitive, we're going to benefit from the huge opportunity that the continental free trade area, offers. We need to make sure that these are small and medium enterprises, what we call SMEs, and our smallholder farmers and small businesses are actually competitive. And in looking at that, it is not just about infrastructure, which is very, very important. It's also about access to finance. You look at what's happening today, whether it's through anchor borrowers program that the central bank has and other sort of programs to encourage SMEs to be productive, you realize that we have not yet begun to tap the potential in that segment of the market. So we need to think through the SME space, we need to think through the smallholder farmers and look at how we're able to aggregate and ensure that they have access to finance. As I mentioned earlier, what is going to make a difference for us as a country is the extent to which we are able to produce goods and services at a price that is competitive. Otherwise, other countries will produce cheaper and we will just be recipient. We will not be able to, export in the right quantity and the right quality, as was previously mentioned. And that is why, the government need to think a lot about how we support SMEs to make sure that they have the access to the funding they require. We help them to up their games in terms of running their businesses, in terms of being productive. In addition to that, the policies that we need, to implement are also very crucial. All of this infrastructure that I talked about is not something that the government alone will be able to deliver. If we're still struggling with, 4,000 megawatts of power today, And these small businesses are really having to use generator and generate power at a very expensive rate. There is no way we are going to be productive and be competitive. But for us to do that, the government alone does not have the financing to be able to deliver them. That is why we need to ensure that the whole public-private partnership in the area of infrastructure development is pursued in a very solid and a consistent way. And, I always say that we do not have a shortage of businesses or investors looking to support trade in our markets. I may have mentioned before that as CDC, for example, we are providing trade finance to over 10 banks in this country. And as of today, we have well over 200 million outstanding. We can do a lot more, but to be able to do that, we need to ensure that our SMEs are well positioned, and that is going to help us to really channel more funding to those small businesses, because I believe that they are a major source of growth and competitiveness in our markets.
Definitely quite a lot there when you look at it. But let me bring in Dr. Tam-George as someone who has had a stint in the public sector and also been the private sector person. I'd like you to speak on how we can get that synergy on both ends to drive the area of growth and competitiveness.
Well, Kenneth, if we want to adopt models that work, we may not always transplant all the details, into our country, but we can at least get inspiration from systems that already work. If you look at Taiwan, for instance, they have one of the most challenging physical topographies in the world. In fact, to make any construction in Taiwan, they will have to import sand and gravels from China. And yet Taiwan, which is a country of just over 23 million people, have the fifth largest foreign reserves in the world, because they've invested so massively in building technical capacity. They have one of the most technically competent workforce. I say this because, Professor Sonaiya, our colleague on the panel, mentioned something about the quality of our work and the productivity that can inspire growth. We do not have those kind of capacities yet. I think that, we can do a lot in terms of investing in our manpower. We've been held captive over the decades by a mentality that emphasizes certification and credentialism rather than actual technical competence. I think that we can invest in that, and try to make sure that we become competitive. It's not enough simply to sign agreements that says, okay, look, we are going to open up our market. Yes, we have 200 million people, and that's a huge market only for those who have something to offer. Now, if you are not competitive even within, how much competition can you be involved in when you are dealing with others? For instance, we can encourage regional integration in terms of trade. For instance, can you imagine if we have an effective rail system that connects, for instance, Benin, Edo State, connects from Benin straight to Port Harcourt, Akwa Ibom, Calabar. A woman leaves her farm in the morning in Benin. By 9 o'clock in the morning, she's already in markets in Aba, Port Harcourt, and by 6 or 7 or 5 o'clock in the evening, she's already back to Benin. You need an effective transportation system to drive trade within the country. We do not have, unfortunately, those kind of very effective transport systems. So if we want to be competitive, we need to make sure we completely reconfigure our internal dynamics. And I think that education, strong infrastructural connections, that connect regions, not just, roads that run, to traffic systems or rail systems that run across cities, no, but systems that actually connect trading centers, business centers, so that people who live in particular places can easily find access to bigger markets in the region. And we don't seem to have those kind of things yet. Now, the other point has to do with the quality of work that Professor Sonaiya mentioned. Almost the entire, economy of Italy, depends on craftsmanship, over 80%. Why is that? If an Italian wants to make a shoe and it takes even 2 months to perfect it, he wouldn't mind. The Italian entrepreneur wouldn't mind. He knows that by the time the shoe or the bag gets into the market, it will beat out the ones in the market, because there's a great deal of emphasis on craftsmanship, on excellence. But we appear to be more interested in simply getting the material into the market. We need to change our value system from simply making money to actually emphasizing excellence in everything that we do, so that we can become more and more competitive. Now we can see that the world is getting very competitive. China is overtaking in many important sectors, overtaking even the United States. So we need to make sure that we completely reconfigure our values. We need to make strategic investments in areas where our people have strength. Nigerians are very self-driven people. We are very entrepreneurial in nature. All we need is probably, the right environment and the strategic investment, coming from government to make sure our people are inspired to be more competitive. I think that, if we have, as I keep saying, the right mix of leadership, we'll be able to get it right. But right now, we don't get that spasm, of courageous, visionary leadership that can drive this kind of change. You can talk about GDP, you can talk about growth, you can talk about all of those things, but if you don't have the right set of leaders to make sure that they implement a particular vision, I'm afraid a lot of these things will end up as mere statistical discussion. So I think that we really need to get the leadership right. I'm afraid that we don't have even leaders who listen to this kind of discussions at this moment. So we need to really make sure that we recognize the kind of emergency we are in. We are in a leadership emergency. There's a big vacuum at all levels. If you go to the States, I once served as a commissioner in the state government, and I can tell you that there's a great deal of deficit in terms of leadership at all levels in this country. And I think that we need to hold a conference where people can say, look, what kind of leadership do we want? We seem to have disproportionate emphasis placed on where the leaders come from, what kind of God they serve, rather the kind of competence that they have in delivering service. Until we realign some of these things, in this country, I'm afraid that, we will be lagging behind. We are already in an emergency, a situation where countries like Djibouti, countries like Ghana are rated far higher in terms of competitiveness, ahead of Nigeria. We're already in a crisis situation. So we need leadership that has a sense of urgency to say, look, we need to develop this country along sectoral lines, specific and strategic investments along sectoral lines. Experts can talk with a sense of urgency because they can see these things in the field. But I don't think that political leadership, sees these things with that sense of urgency, unfortunately.
All right, Dr. Tam-George, definitely raising that leadership question again and talking about the need for value reorientation. But as we wrap up now, I would like to just get a sense from everybody on looking futuristic now about the Nigeria we want a decade from now. We know a decade from now we're going to be meeting the SDG targets, the Sustainable Development Goals as built for 2030, and definitely quite a lot is expected from countries across different indices. And let me start with Bismarck, the economist. One peculiar thing we've seen so far is that in the last 6 months, since the pandemic started, we've seen that uptick of digitalization. And, in fact, I was listening to somebody talk about this earlier today, and they said the world has actually, in terms of adoption of digitalization, we've gone 5 years ahead in just 6 months since the pandemic started. And I'm looking at how we could leapfrog in development indices across board. I'd like to get your thoughts looking at Nigeria a decade from now.
A decade from now, basically, what I expect is to play catch up. Basically, it took 30 years for China to go from 10% of the value of the US GDP to 70% of that. I want you to imagine that catch up. We don't have 30 years to do that. We need to do this between 5 and 10 years. So what drastic things must we do? And what drastic things must we stop doing? Austin talked about leadership. Leadership means leadership in ideas, leadership in action, leadership in execution. Now, what are these things that we must do? First and foremost, some contradictions have to stop. You cannot have inflation rate at 14% or 13.2% and interest rates at 2%. That's no. There's no way you can mobilize savings and bring investments into a country when you have that kind of distortion. You can't say some things and do the other. So we need to stop doing some things, and then we need to start understanding that an investment-led strategy, which links with the sectors that employ people, will not only increase output, but also reduce unemployment and reduce multidimensional poverty. Those are the key things that we need to do, and we have to understand it, and that we don't have time. In 10 years from now, if your population is growing at 3% a year, that means your population would have grown by 30% or 35% between now and 10 years. And what does that mean? 200, 30% of that, you're adding at least another 70 million. So you'll be at 270, 280 million in 10 years. You can't afford to start doing things or continue doing things the same way you've been doing them to expect these spectacular results. We need spectacular results, and that means we need bold, audacious, and very, very ambitious strategies.
All right, then Bismarck says spectacular results is what we need in the decade from now to get to where we want to be. Professor Sonaiya, for you, a decade from now, what priority areas do you think Nigeria should be looking at?
Thank you very much. I'd like to continue along the same line that Mr. Rewane has mentioned in terms of drastic measures, bold, courageous measures that we have to take. And for me, this issue of federal character in our policy is very important, because what it says to us is that we have a pot of money, to share, and everybody has a right to that money, regardless of whether they contribute to the making of that pot of money or not. I think that is absolutely ridiculous. States come and collect money from the federal government. They go back to their states. They do not invest in their human capital. But at the same time, they have a right to have ministers. They have a right to, this whole federal character policy. It does not work. It is not working. It is not giving us the best that we can have, because you must invest in your human capital so that you'll be able to give the best. Even if we had a federal character policy, you must be able to give the very best to that federal system. So I would like to see us take very bold steps to revamp our thinking, to have a thorough mind shift, so that we begin to reorient the whole nation towards the idea of progress and prosperity for everybody in an inclusive manner, not this one that serves the interest of just a small minority of people. That is my hope for the future. And also, I must end with this, a nation where the women also are able to participate in decision making, in policy making, in the leadership of the country, where the girls are free to go to school and will be kept safe in school, so that everybody feels that we have a country that caters to everybody's need.
All right, then Dr. Sonaiya wants a more inclusive Nigeria. But from you, Mr. Adenuga, and looking at Nigeria a decade from now, though, for you, what are your priority areas, especially around infrastructure investment?
Thanks a lot, Kenneth. When I talk about that, I think it's helpful to sort of highlight and reiterate the urgency that Professor Sonaiya and Mr. Rewane mentioned. You need to look at it the other way. If Nigeria fails to do the right things, where can we be in 10 years' time? If our population growth rate continues to exceed our GDP growth rate, poverty is going to multiply. And when that happens, you will start seeing a lot of, social issues. Today, we're talking about security issues. We're talking about insurgency in different parts of the country. If we continue to have our youth having a 35% unemployment, we are looking for trouble. So indeed, we have an urgency on our hands. And to my mind, the Nigeria we're looking for, to be able to deliver that, I think what the country needs to do is to provide the right environment for the private sector to be able to invest. If you look at some sectors today where we're doing, reasonably well, I mentioned telecoms before. You look at the e-payment space, for example. You look at the cement industry. You look at all of these sectors. The drivers are really the private sector. And therefore, it comes down to the question of how do we provide conducive environment for the private sector to be able to operate? How do we provide the right environment for investors to come into our country and invest? The bureaucracy that people need to deal with to be able to do anything in the country, we need to address it. We talked about logistics before, as Dr. Austin mentioned. People produce a lot of agricultural products in the north part of Nigeria. To get it to the southern parts, it is a problem. We have a lot of post-harvest losses. We cannot grow the country while we are doing that. So the issue of infrastructure, the issue of improving ease of doing business, the issue of having the right government policies to encourage all of these areas are things we need to do, because the consequence of not doing that is hard to imagine. It's very, very difficult. As I always mention, I've mentioned before on this program, the reality is that there are a lot of investors, financial investors, DFIs, who are looking to do more in the country. But for them to do that, the risk-reward, trade-off has to make sense. Right now, for many sectors, it doesn't make sense. How do we address those issues so that it becomes a lot easier for investors to come into our country, inject capital, and help improve the economy? And as I've mentioned before, people like CDC will do that, but the environment needs to be right. Thank you.
So, Dr. Tam-George, for you, though, listening to what everybody has said so far, looking at Nigeria a decade from now, though, what are your expectations?
Ken, I think that we've reached a point in this country where even good governance is no longer. Which is why I like that you framed, the discussion in a way that requires a very bold, an expansive vision to turn things around. I think that there should be a massive, all-out investment in education. We need to make sure we build our technical capacity so that we can begin to replace the oil and gas economy with a knowledge-based economy, which is a more sustainable and competitive economy. Sometimes I remind people that the Stone Age didn't end because people ran out of stones. No, people still have stones. It ended. The Stone Age ended because people invented metal and unleashed the Industrial Revolution. So if we really want to leave the oil and gas, the carbon economy, and become more competitive, I think that we need to invest massively in education, build the technical capacity of our people, so that they can compete wherever they are. And at the level of technical education, that is where you have innovation, and that is where you have the competitive edge of nations. I mean, if you look at, Rewane talked about a cited example of China. China is a very competitive country today because, they've invested for decades in building technical capacity. So I think that is a model we could adopt. We need to focus on building the knowledge economy so that in that sense, we will solve a lot of problems at once. You will not be talking about a lot of high percentage of unemployment when people have the technical capacity not only to create jobs, but to also employ themselves. So I think we need to invest massively in education. Secondly, I think we need to rethink our involvement in agriculture. I believe that, it's not enough simply to say over 80% of our people are involved in one form of agriculture or the other. But it's not the extent, it's not the degree to which we are involved in agriculture. It is whether we are industrializing it. It's whether we are injecting technological, tools into agriculture, so that we move from subsistence agriculture into mechanized, technologically driven one, so that we create an alternative agroeconomy. Right now, we still pay lip service to diversifying the economy. But as you know, in the past 5 years at least, we have a massive revenue generation different from oil. So I think we need to pay very close attention to agriculture, because the advantages are clear. We will achieve food sufficiency. We will be able to make sure we have better conditions of life, and people will become, agro entrepreneurs, because they will be able. It becomes a scandal that will be eating apples imported from South Africa when we have different soil patterns and weather patterns in different parts of this country to grow any kind of crop that we need. I think we need strategic, committed investment in agriculture. And I think these are the new frontiers we need to look at. ICT is another goal. We shouldn't leave it simply for the private sector to drive. We need to make sure we have a coherent public policy that says we need to make Nigeria the ICT hub of the continent. We can achieve this in 20 years if there is a specific and direct investment working in partnership with the private sector. But as I said, none of these things will happen if we don't have that sense of urgency at the level of leadership to drive change in this country.
All right, then Dr. Tam-George says we need strategic, committed investments across board in Nigeria. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today. Definitely quite a lot to think about from the comments that you have put forth today. And I can imagine that the policymakers in Nigeria definitely will have a lot to benefit from listening to this lot. Thank you so much. And my guest so far, Bismarck Rewane, the CEO of Financial Derivatives, also Professor Remi Sonaiya, the Nigerian politician and ex-presidential candidate for the KOWA party at the 2015 elections. Also, Tam-George, the Executive Director of the Institute of Communications and Corporate Studies, and last but not the least, Mr. Benson Adenuga, the Head of Office and Coverage Director for Nigeria at the CDC Group. Thank you so much for joining me on this interesting discussion today, and for my wishes to all Nigerians all around the world, happy Independence Day.